To get into the story of Star Trek Beyond, let's go back to its seeds with Star Trek 2009. Released 7 years after Star Trek Nemesis bombed, this reboot film with 2.5 times the budget of Nemesis was helmed by famous creator J.J. Abrams, with a script from writing pair Orci and Kurtzman, whose work on films such as Transformers, which were big successes for Paramount, made clear what the studio was after: a summer popcorn flick that would rake in hundreds of millions. The film made a respectable $385 million globally, but against a $150 million budget, that wasn't as big of a hit as would have been preferred, thanks in large part to weak overseas performance. Nevertheless, it was enough to get the second of this rebooted series off the ground with Star Trek Into Darkness, with an even larger budget than the last one, and involving pretty much the whole of those who had done the first one. The second film did better than the first, buoyed by a 3D release which made the film profitable, but only just, being estimated to make the studios less than $30 million once expenses were deducted. Industry experts attribute this to several factors, but one of the most significant was Paramount's own failure to properly market the film. Paramount was unhappy with the way things were shaking out. They had been the distributors for the first 4 pictures of the Marvel Cinematic Universe: Iron Man 1 and 2, Thor, and Captain America, except for The Incredible Hulk, which had complex rights issues with Universal. But Disney took over for Paramount starting with the next film, which was The Avengers. And while Paramount received a share thanks to the original contract that covered the distribution of the first 6 films, well, it was a rounding error compared to what Disney raked in with the $1.5 billion that the film made. Disney also was bringing back Star Wars, which was drawing the attention of both the public and J.J. Abrams himself. Star Trek 2009 had a significant part of its success attributed to filling in the gap that had been left by the end of Star Wars 4 years earlier. So the return of the genuine article, and by the maker of Star Trek 2009 no less, diminished this selling point considerably. What's more, Paramount was running into other troubles, having lost their deal with DreamWorks. G.I. Joe was a flop as far as franchises went. The rights to future Indiana Jones films were sold to Disney. They were banking on the success of Into Darkness. The intention had been for the Star Trek reboot to be like Nolan's Batman films, with the first one setting the stage for the breakout success of the second. Instead, Into Darkness was critically praised but panned by fans, and rocked by controversies surrounding accusations of sexism and of the whitewashing of the infamous villain, who was of Indian descent and originally played by Latino actor Ricardo Montalban, now being played by the very, very pale Benedict Cumberbatch. To put it simply, Paramount had found itself in a rough spot and was demanding that Star Trek start to fully deliver on its potential. The third of the rebooted Star Trek films needed to be an even bigger hit to make them happy. J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay were brought in to start working with Orci on what was codenamed Washington. You may not recognize their names, but their reputation is actually quite strong in Hollywood. In fact, J.J. Abrams recommended them to Amazon for the upcoming Lord of the Rings series. Kurtzman had moved on, having committed to other projects, but Orci remained behind because he was hoping that he would be able to actually direct this film. There was one big problem there. He had no experience as a director, which is not encouraging for a film that Paramount was looking to not only be a hit, but to be their own Avengers. Also, Orci had alienated Star Trek fans, having repeatedly replied to fan criticisms with profanity-laden egocentric diatribes, and invited further controversy for his 9/11 conspiracy theories, which it is alleged play a substantial role in Into Darkness. So you can understand their trepidation surrounding putting an inexperienced, controversial person in the director's chair. While he did have the job for a brief while, it was the screenplay that cinched the deal, or rather, uncinched it. Reports indicate that it involved time travel, with the Vulcans competing with an alien race to try to gain a time travel device in order to undo the destruction of their planet. The plot device would, according to insiders, allow Pineskirk to meet Shatner's. However, Paramount was less than thrilled with all of this, and in fact shut down pre-production within 2 months of the completion of the first draft, with Orci departing less than 6 weeks later, having a producer-in-name-only role but otherwise gone from the film completely. The hope had been for a 2016 release, being the 50th anniversary of the franchise, and with the final weeks of 2014 drawing to a close, action was desperately needed. Abrams contacted Justin Lin 3 days before Christmas while he was working on Season 2 of True Detective. But what had really made a name for Lin was his work on 4 of the Fast and the Furious films, where it was said that his vision is what turned the movies into the successful, exciting franchise that it has become. Your first thought might be then that his approach to the Washington Project would be the same kind of thing. But Lin was a lifelong Star Trek fan, actually. In fact, the USS Franklin in the film is named after Lin's father, who introduced him to the original series. After taking a few days to think about it, Lin realized he just couldn't say no, even with the enormous challenge of going from essentially blank concept to fully completed film in a year and a half. What Lin knew would help was that he had all the principal actors still on board from the previous 2 films, which meant that not only would the casting process be much less involved, but the actors would be very familiar with the characters, which would be invaluable because the rush production would mean starting the film with material from the second and third act. Knowing their characters allowed the performers to easily hop from scene to scene, as some of the pre-production work was still being completed. In fact, one of those actors was going to play a much larger role in the film, Simon Pegg. The famous comic actor was a clear fan of speculative fiction, and thus had his own ideas for Star Trek to combine with Lin's. A far cry from Orci's controversial behavior, Lin and Pegg in fact valued and involved fans, such as approaching the community of Memory Alpha to ask for help in naming an alien artifact. But despite this, the two, along with Doug Jung, who would later work with Abrams on God Particle, which became Cloverfield Paradox actually, did something that might seem unthinkable for a 50th anniversary celebration, which was to question the very basis of the Federation, to challenge its principles of unity with questions of whether that was harming individuality, and to even make Kirk question whether or not their exploration is just a pointless exercise. The Kirk of this film would change more than that, no longer the impulsive, reckless, self-obsessed dude bro of the previous 2 films. Their Kirk had been seasoned by command and experience into a leader that could still fall into embarrassing comic situations, but more to circumstance rather than his own adolescence and poor decision-making. And speaking of poor decisions, one that had cost them dearly on Into Darkness was Abrams' insistence that the previous film be shot in Los Angeles rather than elsewhere, which would have saved $20 million. Considering that, as stated, the film only profited by less than $30 million, you can see why it was important to get the third film out of LA and to a more economical shooting location. Much of the filmmaking was done in Vancouver, with the first draft finished at the start of June and filming beginning a mere 3 weeks later. By the end of the month, Lin announced to the world that the film was officially called Star Trek Beyond, a name coined by Pegg, who, upon hearing what Lin wanted to accomplish, said that it sounded like he wanted to go beyond what Star Trek had always done before. The central location of the final act would certainly be something new, the fantastic, epically scaled base called Yorktown. But rather than being a constrained hub as previous star bases were, Yorktown was a metropolis in space with a large civilian population, natural vistas, and a multicultural hub that would be the symbol of the Federation for our villain to challenge and our heroes to protect. In addition to the CGI that would obviously be needed for this, much shooting was done in Dubai due to its unique appearance, a location that, coincidentally, was where the sequel to Lin's final Fast and Furious film was shot. Many, including Chris Pine, described Dubai as being the future right here and now, but Pegg in particular noted how it seemed like it was a gateway to a variety of cultures, which of course was precisely what they were going for. Star Trek from the beginning was intended to represent all of humanity as equals, so the 50th anniversary's visual aesthetic was going to present that as well. When Lin explained to Abrams that his view was that the film should deconstruct Star Trek, he explains that he meant to do something with the intention of understanding what it was that had made it worth loving for 50 years. But to challenge it, he felt that he needed a villain that had a vested interest in challenging the Star Trek vision directly, someone who was going to not threaten the Federation's ability to exist, but to, on a fundamental level, challenge its right to exist. To pull that off, he believed that he'd need a named actor, and so approached Idris Elba. Elba seemed to get what the part was right away, and although hesitant about the hours of makeup that he knew the role would require, he was nevertheless on board. In fact, he pushed for the character near the end of the film to still have traces of an alien appearance to him, even when the script said that he should look human. He felt there needed to still be a noticeable inhuman quality to the character. He also did something actors rarely do, asked for fewer lines. He was committed to the character and that character's role, and he felt that in many cases, the less he said, the more the character's silence spoke. Anton Yelchin was a particularly motivating presence. Lynn talked about his impressive improvisational ability that had helped in many of his scenes. And Chris Pine spoke recently about how Yelchin was actually battling cystic fibrosis and was keeping quiet about its effect on him. Even when there were demanding scenes, whether because of the stunt work or the intensity of the situation, Pine said that Yelchin always pushed through without any complaint at all. No matter how much it seemed like he might be hurting, he was committed to making the best film that he could. Tragically, Yelchin would never see the result of his hard work, as he passed away, not in anything related to his health issue, but because of a freak motor vehicle accident, between the completion of the film and the film's release. He was not the only one that wouldn't see the film. Leonard Nimoy had passed away before filming could begin, and Simon Pegg felt that they needed to acknowledge that and say goodbye to him, incorporating this passing into the actual film. Lynn's approach was to lean as heavily as possible on practical effects, which was aided by Joel Harlow's makeup work. Harlow had been on the team that had won the Academy Award for makeup on the 2009 Star Trek film, and so was able from the get-go to work on getting a diverse group of aliens designed in the early days, which served as an inspiration for Lynn, Pegg, and Jung. But with the expense of the literal deconstruction of the Enterprise and the Dubai location shooting, there were a lot of compromises needed, though the practical system helped. However, the decision to use Kirk on a motorcycle would ultimately be a double-edged sword. While it saved money and was exciting, it was also an action scene that wasn't requiring a lot of special effects, and so consequently, when the time came for the trailer, which, appropriately, was going to go before J.J. Abrams' Star Wars film, there were only so many special effects shots to include. So the image of Kirk riding into battle on a motorcycle while the Beastie Boys played seemed to confirm what audience suspected, that this was Fast and Furious in space. This wasn't the only problem with advertising. As with Into Darkness, the marketing didn't seem to do a great job of telling people why this film was special compared to its summer competition. While the BBC had done a fine job of convincing the world the relevance of Doctor Who in the build-up to its 50th anniversary just 3 years earlier, Paramount seemed ill-equipped to do the same. Rather than being the global spectacle that Doctor Who was, Star Trek Beyond was just one more big-budget summer movie. And that's the pity. Beyond shared the summer with controversial and panned remakes such as Ben-Hur, game adaptations like Warcraft and Angry Birds, and disappointing sequels like Independence Day Resurgence and Jason Bourne. The biggest hits were films like Finding Dory and The Secret Life of Pets, showing that a science fiction film with near universal critical acclaim could have had a much better chance if the 50th anniversary would have been there to help drum up support for it, perhaps stopping the Ghostbusters reboot from sucking all the oxygen out of the room in order to allow word of mouth to let people know that this was a film worth seeing. Instead, far from having its Avengers, Paramount had a film that lost them $50 million. In light of that, it's no surprise that, faced with salary issues, the next Star Trek film was shelved for the time being. The future is uncertain. There are many signs that the next film may have a chance in some form, with word of Tarantino's interests, suggestions that Noah Hawley is in talks about it, and rumblings over the merger that will bring Star Trek film and television back under one roof again, that suggests the possibility of something more coordinated in the future. The question will be, what exactly will be beyond? Beyond. But in the here and now, it's time for us to take a look at the film itself, Star Trek Beyond.